Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are joining us from today for the 2020 Global Youth Economic Opportunity Summit live track event ready for the global workforce. We have nearly 250 registrants for today, and we are so pleased to have you with us for our third in a series of virtual summit events between now and October 29th. We are now nearly 8 months into the coronavirus pandemic, an event that has demonstrated the fragility of our social and economic systems, especially for the most vulnerable, including billions of young people around the world. Yet the crisis has also demonstrated the resilience, creativity, and leadership of young people, as well as organizations like you who are working to support young people right now. All of us, development practitioners, funders, policymakers, and young people are trying to make sense of this changing landscape, adapt to the immediate challenges, and predict the road ahead. In a typical year, the GYEO Summit convenes over 4 days in the fall in Washington, D.C., and brings together nearly 500 youth development experts and innovators from over 75 countries. This year required a different approach, one that begins in the midst of the crisis, that convenes expert and youth voices to better understand the current situation. We are using this year's summit event to elevate stories of partners who are collaborating in innovative ways, and to help gather and share critical information, tools, and ideas under the summit theme, Reimagining Youth Economic Opportunities in a Post-Pandemic World. At the heart of this agenda are two key questions. What are the immediate impacts of COVID-19 on young people, and how have our organizations responded? And how can what we are learning now inform what we do next to build more resilient, inclusive systems for youth economic opportunity in a post-pandemic world, or at least one where we are better prepared for future shocks? I want to especially thank our summit sponsors for supporting this year's GYEO Summit and these important online conversations. If you'd like to join us as a summit partner this year, you can contact me, Sarah Sladen, Director of the YEO Network at Making Sense, sarahs@makingsense.com. One of 4 summit technical tracks, the Ready for the Workforce track, explores young people's preparation for, access to, and participation in the formal and informal economy. The track is focused on the impact of a changing workforce on young people, rural economies and agriculture, and employer engagement. This year, we consider these questions and topics in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis and its impact on the global economy now and in the future. We are very lucky to be joined by our expert speakers today. Professor Landry Signé is a senior fellow in the Global Economy and Development Program and the Africa Growth Initiative at the Brookings Institution, a full professor and founding co-director of the Fourth Industrial Revolution and Globalization 4.0 initiative at the Thunderbird School of Management, a distinguished fellow at Stanford University Center for African Studies, chairman of the Global Network for Africa's Prosperity, and author of numerous publications, including Unlocking Africa's Business Potential, Trends, Opportunities, Risks, and Strategies. He is also a World Economic Forum Young Global Leader and a Desmond Tutu Fellow, among many other accomplishments. Benita Rowe is the COO of Ustad Mobile, a startup mobilizing education for all. Ustad Mobile develops open source software to improve school monitoring and deliver content to mobile devices offline. Benita has a decade of experience providing educational institutions with guidance on digital learning and teaching with technology. She has helped educational institutions, government entities, businesses, and organizations use technology to increase access to education, measure and improve learning outcomes. Benita's focus areas are digital equity, learning, and teaching with technology in online, limited connectivity, and post-conflict environments. Respectively, our speakers bring together unique insights from their work on the immediate impacts of COVID-19 on the workforce in the formal and informal economies in sub-Saharan Africa, and the role of education technology to create opportunities for young women and girls to enter the workforce in places like Afghanistan and Pakistan. And both Landry and Benita offer specific recommendations for how we can begin to think differently about youth economic opportunities, particularly for youth who are most marginalized by the impacts of the pandemic. Thank you so much again to our speakers.
Hello, everyone. I am Landry Signé, Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution and Senior Director and Professor at the Thunderbird School of Global Management. I am honored to be a speaker at this extremely important summit, which is focusing on the readiness for a global workforce. I'm particularly happy to be discussing on the impact of COVID-19 on youth economic opportunities in a changing workforce. I will have a particular focus on Africa and the developing world during this brief talk. To begin with, it is important to understand the critical importance and processes through which COVID-19 has affected economies around the world. One is the exogenous factor, so the disruption of the global value chain, the disruption of healthcare in general. So that is one of the factors which has drastically affected economies, not just globally, but also in specific countries. The second factor is the endogenous one, which include the interruption of economic activities or the disruption of economic activities in specific countries, which an important impact on the young population, extremely important, with interruption of the various activities. This is even worsened in many African countries, given the weak healthcare system. A third factor, which is also extremely important, is the commodity shock. On one hand, you will see the reduced demand of products which African countries are used to export, so which is generating revenue for those countries. But on the other hand, also you will see the drop in the oil cost, partly explained by the Russian-Saudi oil price war, which has also led to a reduced income of oil exporters. Adding a few more statistics is important here. Between 2015 and 2035, Africa's working age population will grow by approximately 450 million people. Extremely important. By 2050, Africa will have about 362 million people between the age of 15 and 24 years old. Where will Africa find jobs for such a rapid population growth, and how can the public and private sector be helpful? So, one element which is important here is to mention that about 75% of the new entrants to the labor market will work in self-employment or in micro enterprises. About 20% of them will work in the service sector, and only around 5% will find average paying job in industries. So this means that if these trends continue, only about 100 million of the 450 million Africans are expected to reach, who are expected to reach working age over the next 2 decades, can hope to find decent work. So 100 million can hope to really find decent work. So it's extremely important, therefore, to find alternative strategies to unlock employment potential on the continent. One study that we do at the Brookings institutions focuses on industries without smokestacks. So one of my colleagues called it Africa's alternative path to development. As a matter of fact, when looking at Africa industrial development, most scholars focus on what we call traditional manufacturing, and that is why some will be even speaking about deindustrialization. What is often overlooked is what we call at the Brookings Institution industries without smokestacks. So they are among the most dynamic sectors of African economies, and they include information and communication technology, based services, transport, tourism, for which growth, of course, tourism will be differently affected. But for example, for information and communication technologies or agri-industry, growth has outpaced growth in the manufacturing sector for African countries. For example, between 1998 and 2015, Africa's service export grew more than 6 times faster than merchandise exports. So this is extremely important because, as I pointed out, industry without smokestacks have similar characteristics when we compare them with traditional manufacturing, which include the tradability, the exportability. They are labor intensive, so your ability to absorb a high quantity of moderately skilled worker and with the high level of productivity as well. So it's extremely important to take those into consideration. Another point which is extremely important also is to think about the prospects of African economies. So in my most recent book, Unlocking Africa Business Potential, so I identify 12 key trends which explain why it is critical to invest in specific sector to unlock job creation and create general welfare. So some of those trends include the include the fast-growing population. So African population has grown quite quickly. Some will call it a curse. Others will consider it as a blessing. So, however, what is extremely important to highlight here is that the extent to which Africa population grow, fast growing population, will be a blessing, will depend also on the policies which will be adopted to unlock Africa's potential and ensure that the African population, especially young people, young women, will get the jobs which are much needed for sustained economic development. And as you know, in developing countries in general, 75 to 90% of non-agricultural employment is quite informal and low-paid work. So policy should really focus on unlocking the potential of quality jobs. So other sectors or other key trends include the growth of the middle class, which is connected to household consumption. This is also an important factor because when you have an increase, a proportion of the population with available or discretionary income, so they are also more likely to support broader consumption in sectors such as food and beverage, housing, healthcare, and other consumer goods. So those are sectors where the African young population will definitively find important job opportunities. So the business spending also in agri-industry, manufacturing, construction, transport, those are also areas which will see an important growth. As a matter of fact, by 2030, the combined consumer and business spending in Africa will be about 6.7 trillion US dollar, and for a population of about 1.7 billion people. Other important factors to take into consideration for the young population is definitely so those factors are inclusive of the fast urbanization, as I pointed out, also the rise of industries without smokestacks, the effort to really bridge the infrastructure or close the infrastructure gap. You have the innovation to unlock agriculture, resource, wealth. We have the fast digitalization and the increased technological innovation, and we'll come back to that one. We also have the increased stability, the improvement of the business environment, the ease of doing business, the regional integration with the African continental free trade areas are also some of the important factors. But we also have the rise of new partners and the competition between the established partners such as the United States or France or the UK, and some of the rising partner or emerging countries such as China, Russia, Brazil, India, UK, among others. So those are extremely important factors to take into consideration. But let me come back to the fourth industrial revolution and digital transformation. This is an area where I deeply believe that African should focus on, and not just African, we have also seen around the world how COVID-19 has accelerated the fourth industrial revolution, has accelerated the emergence of technologies associated with the fourth industrial revolution, as well as the digitalization of the global economy. And when I speak about the fourth industrial revolution, as it is what some will be thinking about digitalization exclusively. But no, it's extremely important to specify that the fourth industrial revolution build on digitalization, but go further. Some will be speaking about the fusion between the digital, physical, and biological worlds, and characterized by the velocity, the incredible speed, and the system impact, and the broader scope, which goes beyond industry to affect society, to affect political system, to affect economic development in general. So it is therefore extremely important for the young population to think about the future of work and the skills needed to really succeed in the future. And of course, they have to be supported by policy makers who should fix the labor skill mismatch. Extremely important. So a few solutions that we can propose. So one is to really create a fourth industrial revolution and digitalization task force in various African countries with the aim at really assessing the digital skills and exploring how to bridge the gap between the current skills available and the one needed to succeed for the work force of the future. So this is an extremely important point. Another point is to really create a COVID-19 youth relief fund, which will provide a quick reskilling to the young population, orienting them, providing a specific orientation toward digital skills, an area where jobs could be found. So again, to ensure that the demand meet the offer. So you have to ensure that the supply and demand side are well aligned. To use the disruptive, extremely important as well, to use the disruptive technologies of the fourth industrial revolution to accelerate access to finance, to access to market as well, transaction with customer, and access to social services. And when I speak about access to social services, it's important to not forget about the informal sector, which remain the one who employs the majority of African population in most of the African countries. So extremely important to take that into consideration in order to really leave no one behind. So ultimately, so I think that many areas have incredibly high potential. I pointed out the one related to food and beverages, the consumer market, to the housing sector, healthcare, and pharmaceutical, among other core sector in the consumer market. But in industries, you also have sectors such as agriculture and agri-industries, agri-processing. You have manufacturing, construction, transport, among others, which are sectors which will be extremely important. But the multiplier effect here is really the one associated with the fourth industrial revolution, with will be extremely important to train, skill, or reskill the young population to ensure that the gap is bridged between the extremely important demand and the supply in an alignment with the future of work. Thank you very much for your precious attention.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Benita Rowe from Ustad Mobile. We're a social enterprise with a core focus on designing educational technology that prioritizes the needs of our most vulnerable users first, particularly the needs of vulnerable women and girls. I'd like to start today by thanking Sarah Cole and the team at Making Sense International for organizing the GYEO Summit online this year. I think they've done a fantastic job, and I'm really looking forward to participating in the sessions that they've organized for today to discuss how we can reimagine youth economic opportunity in a post-COVID world. As you're all aware, the COVID-19 pandemic has caused a profound shock to our societies and economies, while worsening existing structural inequalities across every sphere, including youth labor force entry and participation. In normal times, women and girls, particularly vulnerable women and girls, experience disadvantage. In times of crisis, when resources are strained and institutional capacity is limited, they are disproportionately impacted. What I'd like to talk to you about today is what we often overlook in our efforts to create policy and programmatic recommendations at events such as these. And that's the systemic barriers that we as individuals and collectively as organizations have created for vulnerable youth, particularly girls. These barriers not only prevent them from getting a good start in the workforce, but they also prevent them from contributing to policy and programmatic reform that directly affects them and or affects people who have grown up in a similar situation to them. Here's the thing. In order to make meaningful policy recommendations and design impactful programs that sustainably benefit vulnerable youth around the globe, we need to have people who have a variety of different backgrounds, race, gender, geographical, economic, on the payroll and at the table in decision-making positions at our organizations. I'm going to take the social enterprise that I work for, Ustad Mobile, as an example. If I had to pick one thing that I'm particularly proud of our team achieving over the past years, it's the implementation of our offline peer-to-peer sharing functionality in every public university in Afghanistan. Without getting into the technical weeds, the approach that we took hadn't been achieved before, and it enabled educational content to reach even our most vulnerable users, Afghan girls at regional universities, in a technically and financially sustainable manner. In a nutshell, it meant that when the donor funding ended, the learning continued. This is unfortunately very rare in educational technology programs, where it's not unusual to see iPads distributed in contexts where the government expenditure per student per year would be strapped to cover the cost of replacing and shipping new charging cables. Now, there are many organizations and companies that have set out to do this, to reach vulnerable youth through educational technology sustainably. There are two key things, both equally essential, that enabled us to achieve this. The first is that we've always had diverse voices, including former vulnerable girls, at the table, on the payroll, in decision-making positions. The second is that we had a diversity ally in a senior position in the development sector. So here are some things that we do to recruit and retain staff from diverse backgrounds. The first, and this is key, is that we offer paid internships. We make a point of choosing our interns based on their potential, not on the socioeconomic status of their parents. The fact of the matter is, if you're working in youth and workforce development and your organization only offers unpaid internships, you're creating a barrier for vulnerable youth to enter the workforce right out of the gate. You're selecting your interns first and foremost based on the socioeconomic status of their parents. There are no two ways about it. The second is that we have family-friendly workplace policies. Even when vulnerable youth, particularly girls, successfully enter the workforce, they don't have trust funds or generations of wealth building and assets to fall back on in an economic or life emergency. This means that for their entire careers, they are more vulnerable to economic shocks. They are also more likely to take on unpaid domestic work at home, including childcare and caring for aging parents. In addition, they, as are all women, are more likely to experience domestic violence, which almost always involves financial abuse. Family-friendly workplace policies that allow for both flexibility and career progression are key to recruiting, retaining, and supporting staff from diverse backgrounds. So, how do you go about being a diversity ally for vulnerable youth? I'd like everyone today to pick one thing to work on for the next 6 months to a year. Be intentional about it. Look around your organizations. Maybe you can lobby for paid internships that also have a remote component to allow more students from diverse backgrounds to apply and participate. Tony Bloom's team at All Children Reading have been taking this approach for a few years now, which is fantastic. Think about who you mentor, who you speak to at conferences and summits, who you invite to speak on panels, who you follow and interact with on Twitter, who you connect with and support on LinkedIn, which universities you hire your staff from, whether or not you hire graduates without experience from elite universities for in-country project leadership positions instead of investing in qualified local graduates. Above all, question your privilege. Diversify your teams, share opportunity. In order to do good, good intentions aren't enough. We need to do better as individuals and organizations at removing barriers for vulnerable youth, especially girls, entering the workforce. And we need to have policies in place to support them throughout their careers. Removing those barriers and putting those policies in place may be both the most immediate and the most meaningful contribution to youth economic opportunity in a post-COVID world that many of us will make. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you again to our speakers. We're going to transition now to a live discussion with both Landry and Benita. And if you have questions for the speakers based on their remarks, you can add them in the chat box on the bottom right of your screen. There's also a Q&A box. You can use that as well. I have a few questions for our speakers, but do want to encourage you to put your questions forward if you have any, and we'll try to get to them before the end of the discussion. Benita and Landry, thank you so much again for joining us today. It's great to hear your remarks.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us and for organizing this wonderful summit, Sarah.
Well, we couldn't do it without you. You've covered a lot of ground. Both of you do amazing work and research, and you've touched on so many of the big issues that have come up long before COVID that I think have been really amplified and accelerated by the crisis of the pandemic. One of the kind of connecting threads between your different areas of work is you talk about finding alternative paths for youth economic opportunity. And I think that syncs up really nicely with the theme of the summit this year, which is sort of reimagining economic opportunity based on what we're learning about the impact of the pandemic on the systems we built for young people and just how vulnerable they are. And you come to these questions from your respective areas of focus. Landry, you're looking at the potential in the workforce for youth in sub-Saharan Africa. Where is the opportunity for investments? What's the role of the private sector? Benita, you're looking at how we deploy educational technology to lower barriers for young women and girls and marginalized youth more broadly. I mean, both of these issues are huge. Certainly the digital landscape is going to be incredibly important. And this has come up again and again in our summit conversations of, we're getting online, we have to use technology. And in many ways, the fourth industrial revolution, which we've been circling for some years now, is here and moving even faster. So Landry, I wanted to start with you in particular. You referenced overlooked industries, and you call them industries without smokestacks, which is not a term I've heard before, but I think it's really interesting. You talk about ICT, transport, and tourism that have outpaced growth in manufacturing. And you note the extent to which Africa's population growth, which we think about as the demographic dividend when we think about young people, that's really going to depend on the policies we create to unlock the potential of opportunity for youth. And I think this is true everywhere, not just on the continent of Africa. And you offered some really interesting specific policy recommendations. So you refer to the creation of the Fourth Industrialization Task Force in different countries to assess digital skills, how to bridge the gap. And you also talk about the COVID-19 relief funds to provide quick reskilling for youth to orient them to digital skills and where jobs can be found, matching supply and demand. And then you also say, don't forget the formal sector, because that's where a lot of the jobs are. I wondered if you could provide a specific example of a country that is potentially leaning into one or more of these ideas and embracing some of these ideas of quality jobs and alternative paths. And if so, what's working for that specific government or country, and what remains a challenge, do you think?
Thank you very much, Sarah. That's a very important question. So let me speak, although the country also is facing challenges, because I think none of the country has solved the question of youth unemployment, in particular on the continent. South Africa has taken a different path. For example, it's the first country on the continent to have adopted a Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution. The president created a task force. He wrote a piece also in Foresight Africa, the flagship publication of the Africa Growth Initiative, explaining his strategy, how he intends to capitalize on the fourth industrial revolution. A recent study, for example, by McKinsey has shown that new technologies or areas related to the fourth industrial revolution are likely to absorb by 2030 around 1.7 million young new graduates. So that is an important factor. And for women, facilitate the employment of about 1.6, I think, million women. And the net job gain, because many people are also concerned, will they lose their job? The net job gain will be over 1 million of jobs in addition by 2030 as well, in addition of unlocking the economy and accelerating growth, inclusive growth. So we can clearly see that although South Africa is also facing important challenges, specific policies have been adopted. One of our senior non-resident fellow at the Brookings institution, who is also involved in the industry, one of the leaders of the project on industry without smokestacks, is also one of the member of the eminent people advising President Ramaphosa, among others, to really bridge that gap between the knowledge, research, innovation, and actual policies.
So as a follow-up to that, what is the role of private industry in all of this? We see governments trying to put forward these really ambitious workforce development programs responding to the moment, but we know private industry has a role. If they represent so much growth and potential, why do we continue to see this emphasis on skilling in manufacturing? Is it just a more, recognized path? Is it just difficult for governments to switch gears and kind of implement at scale these different approaches and emphasis on skilling? Or is it on employers in these sectors to make those investments in upskilling? I mean, how do we talk about kind of the roles and responsibilities of government versus the private industry?
I love that question. Extremely important to focus as well on the private sector. On one hand, it's the responsibility of the government to create an enabling environment to reduce the cost of doing business, to build infrastructure, among other factors. However, development will not happen without the private sector. So the private sector, in my work, the private sector is critical for job creation. And when we speak about the private sector, we have, of course, large corporations, but we also have entrepreneurs, young entrepreneurs, including women entrepreneurs. If I just take some illustration, gifted mom in Cameroon who created an application to increase woman health and as well as young-born health or child. So that's one of the illustration. You have CardioPad also created to really increase, which is also an application created with a tablet created to really increase cardiac health. So we can see that. So we have to see at different levels The challenge sometime in the private sector, especially for young, is scaling up things. And that is where investors are important. That's where the government should also create the enabling environment, provide resources when necessary. But as you pointed out, Sarah, I think that the private sector role is critical. Some corporations, if I speak, for example, about the OCP in Morocco, which is one of the leading businesses in the world in phosphate-based fertilizer. They create the, training programs, development programs. They have even launched a university to really reskill, and I have engaged with many. I'm also a non-resident fellow with them. I have engaged with many of the people that they have trained. I can tell you that they're extremely competent and they find jobs quite quickly. So yes, the private sector role is critical because it would also reduce the cost, because even when the private sector recruit people who come directly from university, they also have to provide additional skills and having a planning of improving the skill of employing of in order to also adjust and shift to the constantly changing environment. You have seen with COVID-19, people were not able to adjust with the fast digitalization, were left behind.
Yeah, I think that the increase of the digital divide is a huge issue, but you've talked about kind of connecting all the dots and, bringing together not just private industry and policymakers, but how we kind of knit these pieces together. And when we talk about the private sector, I appreciated that you referenced, entrepreneurs and small businesses and young people trying to get started up into the private industry.
And perhaps the last one on this is that agile governance and multi-stakeholder collaboration will be extremely important. In the current context, government are not anymore the sole responsible of policy making. Private sector is critical. Citizens, non-governmental organizations, corporations are really critical, and it's important to really engage in those multi-stakeholder collaboration to reach optimal outcome. And they require flexibility, adaptability, speed, and they also allow to really create human-centric innovation, innovations which will serve on one hand, which will allow to create environment which will allow on one hand the private sector to continue to innovate and to employ young people, but on the other hand to make sure that those innovations also serve the greater good.
That's great. I think the idea of collaborative policy making and rethinking whose responsibility it is to design and create policy is a really important kind of mental shift for all of us. And it actually sets up, Benita, you quite well, working with young women and girls and talking about kind of an inclusive approach to doing this work. Landry referenced digital transformation as an area of needed focus, and we've certainly seen, the acceleration of those needs. And what I really appreciate is that you have connected policy and practice by grounding some of the major impacts on women and girls trying to participate in the workforce with some practical examples of what your organization is doing to lower barriers and engage women and girls in the workforce, Benita. And you referenced a few things specifically. You referenced paid internships, so shifting the selection of interns and opportunity away from socioeconomic status, so who's already kind of at the table and has an opportunity to walk through that door, with looking for potential. And I think looking at how tech can be used to assess and understand potential outside of traditional ways is a pretty interesting area of opportunity and growth. You also talked about family-friendly workplace policies. So, this is huge. Looking at, how young women and girls are vulnerable to economic shocks and how these shocks have this ripple effect. So women end up taking on unpaid work. They're more likely to experience domestic violence, that the economic impacts have social impacts that ripple down and really impact this particular population. And then you talked about being a diversity ally for vulnerable youth and actually looking inside our own organizations to look at our own behavior, our own assumptions, how we select, engage, and include or not. So on so many levels, I think this is a really interesting kind of look at some specific practical things that we can do in practice, connecting some of these big policy challenges that Landry referenced to some work in practice. So I think we lost you there for a second. Well, I'll keep going while you sort out your camera on your side. But I did want to talk a bit about kind of the ways that we rethink ed and technology for workforce. And one of the things that struck me while Benita was speaking was that we often look to technology itself, blockchain, iPads, mobile phones, as the solution to the problems, especially in moments like this when connectivity is so essential, rather than the people, practices, and systems behind its implementation. And while we wait for Benita to come back, maybe Landry, you can address this broader question of kind of the social elements of changing our mindsets. Oh, you're back. Benita, welcome. I don't know if she can hear us okay. Well, maybe I can put this question to you, Landry, and thinking kind of about how we shift our mindset away from kind of the big policy questions to practice. Like, how do we actually change the way we implement and approach engaging, for example, training providers in a moment like this, and think about kind of a systems-based approach? Are you having success on the ground in some of the work in sub-Saharan Africa to influence governments? Are they receptive to these kinds of ideas of greater inclusivity, particularly for vulnerable populations?
Yes, Sarah, I think it is extremely important, and you are highlighting a core factor. When people hear about the fourth industrial revolution, they will often think industrialization technologies, where it is clearly that you have, of course, the emerging technologies, but on the other hand, the scope is broader. You have the social aspect, the economic aspect, the political aspect, among other. And as I see that Benita came back, I will give her the floor so that she will be able to answer the questions and react as I have spoken.
We're moving in real time. This is technology in practice. Thanks so much.
I am so sorry about that.
No
Literally
problem.
died right in the middle of Sarah's comments there.
Not a problem. So did you hear the question, Benita? We're talking kind of about how you're promoting these ideas for inclusion that are really kind of social questions. And, you know, you
Right.
talk about workplace support for women with children, you talk about paid internships and moving past kind of socioeconomic barriers to opportunity to access, talk about diversity. I mean, these are issues that we are debating in the United States, but you're working in places like Afghanistan. And I wanted to understand a bit more from you, kind of the practical side of your work and how, as an advocate for these approaches with women and girls, what's been effective for you in bringing people to the table, whether that's families or policymakers?
I think now we're kind of moving into a time where it's broadly recognized that that these disparities exist and that we need to do something about it. So in terms of staff, with the donors and INGOs that we've worked with, they've all had really good workplace policies in place for their female staff. And as we've started to grow as a startup, so I was the only female and now I'm not, we've kind of tried to look at how we can introduce family-friendly policies just to really make that possible for people to work with kids or manage caring for parents, have that flexibility, but still have that career progression. And it works. I mean, we don't need people sitting in one spot from 9 to 5 every day, right? What counts is that the work is done. And we're a small team, and if something happens and somebody with a child has to go to the doctor or something like that and something's due, then someone else can jump in and give them a hand. We're really trying to foster that culture. Yeah. that's very, very important to us. And I think just more and more organizations are kind of starting to see that as well and support that. There's that side. So there's supporting young women and vulnerable youth entering the labor force kind of from our end. But in the training, in the educational technology side of things that we do, there's also things that we really need to look at to make sure that our programs are accessible to vulnerable women and girls, because they are our most vulnerable users. So women and girls are less likely in the places that we work. They mostly have a low-end Android phone, but it's usually a hand-me-down. So we have to be able to support really old versions of Android that Google doesn't really support more, right up to the newest versions of Android. And that's also a key reason why we took an offline first approach, because we started in Afghanistan and our most vulnerable users there often didn't have access to mobile data. So it was so important to be able to share that content from phone to phone without requiring us to be flown in and set up Raspberry Pis and this kind of thing. It needed to be possible for somebody in a rural university to just do it with the flick of a button and access that learning content offline. And what we've found is that if we design things for our most vulnerable users, which are almost always women and girls in regional locations, everybody else can access it as well. So that's the approach that we try and take. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a real shift in design thinking, really. I mean, we have a few sessions through this summit series of organizations looking specifically at strategies for, human-centered design, and starting from a different place where you think about, going from zero access to online resources to digital tech, all the way to, some of the more advanced platforms that young people are engaging for workforce opportunity. And I think this is a really interesting issue because, we right out the gate when we started these conversations through the summit on, what are we learning from the pandemic right now? One of the big ones was there's an enormous opportunity to use technology and ed tech to engage as many youth as we can, accelerate training, get them access to opportunities that they wouldn't necessarily be able to in the formal workforce or through traditional sort of pathways to a job. And at the same time, this is going to really amplify an existing digital divide. And it's not just about, building an ICT platform, but actually doing major electrification projects in rural areas.
Right.
How do you get youth that are offline engaged and training? And I think all of our organizations are struggling with that, particularly those that are looking to engage young people and include them. But it's an interesting way of changing how we come at the problem and starting offline, thinking about what can sustain after we've left and not leaving, technology that can't be deployed once the funding is of the project.
Right. And I think just another important point there is because we started working mostly in post-conflict environments that are still in areas very insecure. If you're rolling out device dumps, devices that obviously don't come from those places, might have a USAID sticker on them, that sort of thing, you're actually endangering already vulnerable members of the population should something happen, because post-conflict, it kind of flares up every now and then. So you can actually put people's lives in danger if things change and they are then caught with a foreign device. So that was another reason that it was so important for us. It has to be offline. We have to support the devices that people have, and our most vulnerable users having these low-end devices. Also out of security reasons. And I think that's often not realized. And also the success of your ed tech program is directly linked to the financial sustainability. So we work with donors and governments, and whatever we do, the donor funding, we see it as covering the initial costs, the initial startup costs. But we have to engineer everything in a way that means it can run without extra costs and that it mitigates the cost of mobile data for users afterwards.
Yeah. It seems like it would be a potentially good pitch to a government. It's Landry's point of like, we've got to invest in these, non-smokestack industries. But
Right.
I imagine some of the early questions are startup costs and how do we do this at scale and how do we reach populations that might be rural or poor or don't have access. So some really good lessons, I think, from these specific projects that you're doing.
Yeah, and I think, you know, it's important to continue pushing on a policy level for high quality internet access everywhere, but it's going to be a little while before we have that. So if we're working in education and youth and workforce development, it's still so important to design for our most vulnerable users first, and not to sort of build this amazing platform and then think by next year they'll be able to access it.
Right.
Or we'll figure out that part later. No, that part's the most important. Yeah, and just an example, where I grew up, the farm where I grew up, we still don't have internet, right? And that's Australia. So
well,
it's going to take a while. Yeah.
So
yeah.
We have just a few more minutes before we transition to our 4 concurrent breakout sessions. And the breakouts are going to dive more deeply into some specific technical areas of workforce and youth economic opportunity. But I think many of the bigger themes that you both have identified here resonate and I think connect to some of what we'll be exploring in the breakouts. Before we do that, and before I walk through kind of the logistics of the transition to those breakouts, I wanted just to give you both an opportunity for some kind of final thoughts. And again, you're both coming at these from slightly different areas, but I think some of the issues you're contending with around, you know, where is the opportunity? Where are the industries that we need to be investing in? How do we skill up youth for those opportunities? And how do we connect youth that are most disadvantaged to these pathways of opportunity really align? But we're sitting here 8 months into the pandemic. We still have, I think, a long road ahead of us. You know, even if we have a vaccine tomorrow, we're looking at, you know, I think several years of rebuilding. And it's an opportunity to change how we think about rebuilding those systems for youth and really adapting a systems thinking approach, which I think is reflected in both of your research and your work. What are some of the kind of key asks you would make if you were sitting across the table from, you know, a policymaker, someone with their hands on a budget, the ability and the power to make those decisions of where we invest? What would be maybe 1 or 2 recommendations or areas where you think, you know, we've got to invest right now? And Landry, maybe I'll start with you if you have some thoughts on kind of what would be your ask, what would be your big kind of COVID pandemic recovery ask for creating youth economic opportunity?
So thank you very much, Sarah. So I think that it will be extremely important for policymakers to really engage in multi-stakeholder collaboration to bridge the labor, digital skill, and broader labor skill mismatch. I think, and that can start now. You have different type of program. It's not just through curriculum reform. Of course, that aspect will also be important by 2030 for the implementation of those goals by 2030. But in the short run, it's extremely important to provide resources to address the immediate needs of the one left behind, while reskilling. And I think Benita provided a beautiful illustration of the work that they are doing, education, and as Nelson Mandela says, the most powerful weapon that you can provide to someone. So that is what I will be thinking. So focusing on bridging the labor skill mismatch for young in general, for women, especially young girls in particular, or young women in particular, as we are speaking about work. But that also comes through the training of young girls who are the young women and the women of tomorrow.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Benita, I'll give you some closing comments.
Thank you. So if I had a policymaker sitting across from me, I would say I'd ask them to recognize that, you know, internet connectivity is something we want to strive for globally, but it's also not a binary state. Okay, so there's a big difference whether or not you can download or watch video or use Zoom or send a WhatsApp message. every now and then. So it's definitely important to be on the agenda and strive for, but we also need to design, especially in education policy making, we need to design for our most vulnerable users first, not for the future, and then somehow we'll figure it out for the most vulnerable users. And I think, you know, one of the most important things, what's really key to achieving that is having people from vulnerable backgrounds influencing policy, right? So going beyond focus groups, which are important. Focus groups are important, right? But we need to have people in decision-making positions. And that is really to get them into a position on a career track where they can be in decision-making positions. We need to not make it impossible for them to enter those career paths. That's where paid internships and things like that are really crucial. So I just think, yeah, those would be my comments to policymakers, and also really look at how they can be diversity allies, you know, and actually everybody working in development. That's going to be the game changer.
Yeah, that's the final point, I think, is it's not just on policymakers. I know we've been kind of picking on that in this session, but really on all of us. It's
always fun.
Yeah. It's on all of us. And certainly these are conversations we're having here in the United States and around the world about who do we have and who do we allow to be at the table of decision making, and how do we create those paths, and that we benefit from people who have direct experience and who have lived these lives to help shape and design and implement policy and investments in young people. So I am so grateful to both of you for jumping into today's conversation, to supporting the learning agenda for this year's 2020 GYEO Summit. Thank you so much for your time and your comments. We are going to transition now to our breakout sessions. I'm just going to share my screen one last time, and you can see where we are. Hopefully you all can see this. We are going to transition to breakouts. These are 60-minute, 4 concurrent sessions led by our summit partners. We're really excited about the sessions we have today, and thank you so much again to all of our presenting organizations for bringing your knowledge and sharing some of the information about that you're learning on the ground from your programs. We are recording all of these sessions, including today's opening. So this will go up on the summit website, and it will go out through our newsletter. So if you want to revisit this conversation or any of the breakouts, you can also do that. Thank you so much again to our speakers and to everybody for joining us. We hope you have a great rest of your day, and we will see you again at our next event on September 24th with our sponsors FHI 360 and ATTA. We're going to be doing a special focus on travel and tourism and the impact on that industry, and kind of how we can rethink the industry and what the opportunities are for young people. We'll have another event on the October 8th for building a foundation, and then we'll have our closing event on October 29th. So a lot going on, lots coming up. We're very excited to continue the learning to the conclusion of this year's GYEO. But for now, thanks again, everybody, for joining. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Take care, guys.
Thank you.